historian. He convinced the Queen of England she should apologize for kicking the Cajuns out of Canada. And of course, he runs the Cajun Museum. I think he founded it and is very familiar with Vermilion and Louisiana history. So that's what the program is going to be about tonight. Warren, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, Harold.
I just need to share one item. In the last program, we had Dr. Malcolm Vidrine talking about the Cajun prairies, which is about 3.5 million acres of prairie land from the Vermilion Bayou to the Sabine, roughly, and hardly none of it's left. Maybe 1,500 acres or so in small parts. The biggest piece might be 60 or 70 acres. And he mentioned the Native American Prairie Program up in Montana. And my wife and I went up to Montana to visit that. And it's an amazing program, all non-governmental in any kind of way, all funded by private donors. They have acquired 1.3 million acres of Montana prairie, mostly close to the Missouri River in northern Montana, near Lewistown. And they are restoring the wildlife, the prairie chickens, the elk, the bison, beaver, wolves, bear, and in places where alfalfa has been grown, they're restoring the botanical regime. This program is a fantastic program. It has a wonderful reception center in Lewistown, and we think in the Cajun prairies should follow that success example. In fact, this is the prairies of America, so we hope to include the Cajun prairies and do some restoration and bring the bison and the elk back to Louisiana. Very few people have knowledge that, for instance, the Cypress Lake on the UL campus was an old buffalo stone. And all through the Cajun prairies, you have these ponds that the buffaloes wallowed around in the mud, formed these little ponds. And that's certainly, if we get enough acreage, I don't think 1 million acres, but if we got 3,000 or 4,000 acres, we could restore the bison, the prairie chickens that were there, and some are still there. The Atwater prairie chickens still there. So anyway, that's something that hopefully can be restored, should be restored. So Warren, tell us about growing up in Henry, Louisiana. That was down to Vermilion, on the east side of Vermilion, right now near the big woods and oak plantation. And you went to the Henry High School, I guess. And so share with us what farm life was growing up in the 40s.
I was born in 47, a baby boomer. My older brother Terry was born 5 years before me, and he only spoke French until he started school. So when I was born, my parents decided he had so much trouble at school being punished, they were going to only talk English to me. So we were a bilingual family. I understood French, but my parents deliberately tried to avoid speaking French to me unless I was working in the rice or corn or cotton or sugarcane fields or working the cattle. Then everything was in French. But we lived just a half a mile from where the Henry Church is today and where the school used to stand. It was the first high school in Vermilion Parish because the population of the parish was structured along the Vermilion River south of Abbeville. You had numerous large plantations, especially around Banca. You had 4 huge. The Banca Cade plantation was well known. And today you only have live oak plantation. But I milked cows before I went to school. Harvested
And when
hay.
you got back.
And when I got back, I had to take care of the cattle. But it was a great
twice a day.
Yes.
I guess you made your own butter too.
Absolutely, made our own butter. I spent the rest of my life trying to eat peanut butter and cheese because Mama...
The cream had to come to the top, and it's from the cream that you churn the butter.
Exactly. And Mama would, she wouldn't buy peanut butter or cheese because she made her own butter. She'd never buy anything she could make on her own. So we were raised that way. It's almost self-sufficient. Once a year, drive to Lafayette, go to Hyman's to go shopping for clothes before school started. And I was always warned by my mother, don't talk French in public buildings or schools. They're going to laugh at you. So you kind of felt you were kind of on the margins, sort of marginalized growing up. Not in our area, because everyone was Cajun, everyone was Catholic. They'd let us out of school to go to catechism. They'd let us out of school to go to the Way of the Cross. The church and the school were almost synonymous. You know?
Right. Although it was a public school.
Public school,
Right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there was a school like that in Parks, and there was a lady that drove a Cadillac, and I had to go get it. I was in the car business, and I got there at about 8 in the morning, and there's no one there, and I finally found the janitor, and says, "Where's all the kids?" "Oh, they're in Mass." I said, "Is this a Catholic school?" "No, but they go to Mass every morning." So Henry was similar.
Yeah, and during Lent, we had to go to church every day because I was an altar boy. So they would delay the start of school until they finished the Mass in Lent. And it was just the way things were at that time. I was always proud of the fact that I finished third in my high school graduating class. But I wouldn't tell anybody we were only 12 in the class. I had the same teacher for 4 years.
So you made it to UL from there.
We did. We of the 12, 9 of us went to college and 4 of us have advanced degrees. I mean, it was almost like having tutors with small classes.
Sure.
The same woman taught me English 3 years, Miss Dill.
Wow.
And we would joke she never finished a book. So yeah,
Were there multiple classes in one room?
No,
Or you had individual classes?
no, we had
yeah?
individual classes.
So
Yes.
this is a pretty big school. And then, I guess when did you start the Cajun Museum in Erath? And share with us the history and how that works, and your Living Legend program that honors people who have done some good for Acadiana and Louisiana.
In '88, one of my friends, Walter Amahara, who had been a national champion weightlifter at SLI, I was on the team later, but I knew Walter, and he called me and he said the American government just apologized to Japanese Americans for their internment after Pearl Harbor during World War II. And that apology was made in 1988. And that led me to think about why not asking the Queen and England to apologize for our deportation from Nova Scotia. And so it took me 2 years to gather the lawsuit materials. But that's really what started the museum, Harold. It captivated people's attention throughout the world, and many Acadians started coming to interview me, to help me, and we started the museum that way in 1990. So we've been in operation since then, and in 1997...
Is it open every day? What are the hours
It's
of operation?
every day except Sunday and Monday in
Okay.
the afternoons. It's on our website, acadianmuseum.com, and also Saturday mornings from 10 to 12. It's all free. No one gets paid. We have 50 wonderful volunteers. They go open it every afternoon. They're all bilingual speakers. They know the history. And it's really a jewel for Vermilion Parish. It's really the largest Acadian museum in the United States. We have over 6,000 objects. And in
You have maps?
we have some very rare maps. We have one particular map which is dated 1630, allowing sailing ships to navigate into what was Nova Scotia at that time.
Wow.
And we have an early map of Vermilion Parish, which is on cloth, hand written, and it shows the early Spanish land grants, which would have been in the 1770s to the 1800s. We decided in 1997.
You'll have a pretty good history of Pecan Island and Chinarity, that region.
We touch on the wetlands a lot, yes. We have a lot of artifacts that people have donated, and Dr. Mark Reese here at USL has helped identify, which all along the coast, we do know that they had a lot of middens where a lot of the Native Americans would migrate and live off the land, off the marshland, wetlands. So we have an excellent collection of
The
that type.
Vermilion Parish they had the pyramid mounds, which I grew up there during the war, so the pyramid mounds we'd go play on, and they were where the Vermilion Bayou hit Vermilion Bay. And there are 3 mounds. And they were up about 30 feet. And the biggest one must have been about a half acre across the top, had no vegetation on it.
Right.
Now, they dredged them up in 1949. And then they had the square mound on the northeast corner of White Lake, which was a perfect square with the diagonals oriented north, south, east, west.
Mm-hmm.
And then about 200 yards north of the square mound was a round mound. And in 1931, somebody brought a skull to the Abbeville Burial. And a few months later, the editor of the Burial convinced Shel Morgan he could take him to those mounds that were being dredged up to build the road from Intracoastal City to Perry, and then from Esther to Forked Island. That's where the shells came from. And this old man Gooch had the Get restaurant in Abbeville, you can remember.
Mm-hmm.
He'd pay kids 25 cents a 5-gallon bucket of the artifacts that they found along those roads. And he had a garage full of them, and somebody stole them all, and they were reported, and they got rid of the evidence by throwing all the artifacts in buckets off of one of the bridges in Abbeville. and so, but the round mound was a burial mound, and the square mound wasn't. And then from the round mound to the Oak Ridge, about 2 miles away up on the north side of near Forked Island, there's a road. And it was the only incident in archaeological history in Louisiana where they built a road. And the Abbeville Meridian article said that when they came in view, there were hundreds of skeletal remains on the barges with the shells. And the bones of the Native Americans would work, the bones of the savages would work as well as the shells to smooth out the road for our modern automobiles.
Sort of morbid.
Yeah, and I have a copy of that article in the original.
Well, I duck hunted on Lac Coq, which is a large lake between the Boston Bayou and Iberia Parish, and that land was acquired by my great-grandfather, Irish Steed Broussard, who was one of the largest cattlemen in Vermilion Parish. And hunting,
he took the cattle to Marshall.
Exactly.
And share with us how that worked. When did they take them? They wintered them there, didn't they?
That's correct. And it was actually like socialized farming. Every farmer in the region of Henry, that whole area, the larger area, is called La Prairie Grieg, because the first settler was a Grieg from Denmark, George Grieg. And then the Acadians came after that. He was there about 1790, I guess. And they decided their cattle would do better in the marsh during the winter, because in the prairies, of course, you lose your grass in the winter,
Yeah.
but you don't lose your marsh grass.
Right.
And so they would put all their cattle together, march them to Banca, put them on barges, and they even had a big camp built, and the men would stay there. They'd take turns taking care of
Watching
the
the
cattle.
cattle.
Right. And of course, cooking big meals and playing big poker games, I'm sure, too, drinking much whiskey.
Wow.
That was some real cowboys.
But you see, that Lighthouse Point, which, by the way, that was wiped out by a hurricane in 1858 or something like that. And the lighthouse keeper was a butcher from Lafayette. And he died in that hurricane. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, they found him on the little island, as I was past, which they've called Dead Man's Island ever since.
I was never old enough to make the trip, and they stopped doing that because then you started having hay balers and commercial feeds, so you didn't
You didn't
need
have to
do
send
that.
them, yeah.
But the real test of the fortitude of these cowboys was to get the cattle out of the marsh and bring them out in the spring. Okay, so every man had to have 2 horses. A horse could only last half a day. It was so strenuous to run them
To
out
run
of the
them in
marsh,
the marsh, yeah.
and put them back, and then tresser them. In French, you know, you tresser them, you separate them.
Yeah.
So every day they would take one family and try to get his brands in the pen and put them on a barge, and so
and
his
take 'em out.
cattle went home,
Yeah.
and they put them on the road.
Yeah.
And so that's why everybody in Henry had to have a fence, because cattle would go in the yards and eat the gardens, vegetables.
Sure.
So everybody had to have a cattle guard and a fence at that time.
And
So-
that was throughout the prairies. The prairies were public land, all the way, you know, into Acadia, Western Vermilion. That was all public land, and the state decided to sell it all in 1880, and they sold all that prairie land for 25 cents an acre.
Wow.
And farmland in the South was $200 or $300 an acre at the time. But, you know, the federal people were in charge, and they made the rules, and they set up the state land office. They sold the woodlands and prairie lands, really, which was farmland, for 25 cents an acre. And then the marshland is sold for 12.5 cents an acre. And
Well-
so people bought, you know, I mean, the people that bought the Exxon land, they were duck hunters from Minnesota. They came in and bought thousands of acres for nothing, just for duck hunting.
Well, it's interesting you opened up with the prairies and we're talking about cattle, because it's cattle that brought the Acadians that had landed in New Orleans in 1765 across the Atchafalaya. Nobody wanted to come here because they feared the Attakapaw, rumored to be cannibalistic, but New Orleans had a meat shortage, and so the bargain was, under the Dauterive Cattle Compact, they said you can have all the land you settle, you just got to bring cattle to New Orleans. So the first cowboys were the Acadians in 1770s to the 1800s, bringing cattle to the Spanish
And
colony.
New Orleans was one of the biggest cities in the country.
Yeah, yeah. But they got on their feet very quickly, and my great-grandfather, Irish Steve, was a 5th-generation descendant of Beausoleil Broussard. Everybody in the family's been in the cattle business, and when Irish Steve was on his deathbed, he asked his 8 children never to sell an acre of land. He said, we earned it riding horses and cattle, and we still today have every acre in our
Wow.
family. We are 100 heirs, roughly, give or take, and we manage it together as a family farm to this
Oh,
day.
wonderful.
So it lets us keep in
And-
touch
and
with
that
cousins.
is in the Henry area?
That's the Henry area where the Henry Hub plant is.
Yeah.
That was originally land that my great-grandfather had leased to Texaco, an 80-acre tract where they first drilled and established the Erath unit.
And there's the McGee Farm. They were 2 old maids, weren't they?
3
old maids.
3 of them lived 1 mile behind. They literally were self-sufficient. They came to the store in Henry twice a year, by buggy, horse and buggy. I
Wow.
remember that.
Wow. Wow. And they were farming rice and,
Rice, yes, sir.
yeah,
Rice on the edge of the marsh.
and raising cattle also, I guess.
Raising cattle, and what you could do, you see, the techniques that the Acadians had developed in Nova Scotia by building dikes and reclaiming land from the sea, they did the same thing in southern Vermilion Parish. The McGee's had reclaimed land. You just got to build a levee and figure out, let the salt drain out through flat valves, and ultimately you're going to have some productive lands.
Yeah,
And that was done all along the marsh there,
yeah.
where the
Wow.
prairies met
Right on
marsh.
the edge. Yeah, and it
Exactly.
was
And of course
really
the
rich
tides.
wetlands.
And you only had tides 2 or 3 feet at most, you know,
Yeah.
your normal tides.
Yeah. So Banker had a church there. That was kind of they had a ferry there for a long time.
A school
But-
and a grocery store and a post office.
Yeah, that was one of the first post office in the Louisiana Purchase, was at Banker.
The church was built about 1880, and until 1930, when the railroad came through north of Abbeville and Erath, all the people started moving to the railroad, and so the population diminished, and they moved the church from Banker by mule
To Henry.
to Henry, where it still stands today, and it's a remarkable testament.
Really?
After it was destroyed by Hurricane Rita, the people would not let go of their church. They raised $1 million,
They
and it
raised
raised it 12 feet.
So that's the original church?
That's the original church from Banker.
Wow, that is amazing. That is amazing. You might share the public with this no man's land, you know, it was contested whether the Louisiana Purchase didn't include Vermilion Parish and everything all the way west to Texas.
That's why they said the West started at Scott.
Yes, right, yes. And so this was kind of a, outlaws took off there, and, you know, I mean, that was really, until I think the Mexican War of 1847-48 finally settled. Because when we invaded Mexico and took over Mexico, we took everything we wanted. New Mexico, Arizona, California, Oregon, Washington, Utah, you know, it was equal to Louisiana portion. President Polk at the time, you know, and he, in fact, the commanding general was from Lafayette, and he had married General Mouton's sister, and General Gardner. And he was also the commanding officer in the Confederacy at Port Hudson.
Well, Lafayette Parish, as I'm sure you know, is celebrating their 200th anniversary of the creation of the parish of Lafayette. And I have an exhibit at our museum about the role that the Marquis de Lafayette played in the Louisiana Purchase. Because when Jefferson would go to Paris to negotiate,
He thought he was buying New Orleans.
yeah, right, yeah. Well, he would stay at the Marquis de Lafayette's house. He would host them, and he would gather the parties together and try to bring them together, because he was one of the most highly respected men in the world, because he had helped George Washington win the American Revolution. But in the description of the land,
And he was only 19 or 20 at the time.
19, and the richest man in the world.
Wow.
That's why he was able to finance his own army. He didn't get any, it was all private money.
Wow.
And that's why Washington respected him so much. But in the description, they weren't exactly clear on the boundaries. They simply said, we're selling the lands drained by the Mississippi River, which is why it reaches so many states and all the way into Canada, but it excludes southwest Louisiana and includes
It
Vermilion
did,
Parish.
yes.
Excludes it, because we're not drained by the
We're
Mississippi.
not. Yeah. Vermilion Bar was the end of it, you know.
Exactly, that was
Yeah.
the boundary.
That was the boundary, yeah.
And so because it was no man's land, you didn't have any law and order, it was an attractive site for scoundrels, scalawags, criminals to go out and get lost and just sort of start a new life.
Yeah. You know, then all that prairie land was public land until right after the Civil War in 1880. They set up the state land office to sell all that, and it was a bargain basement price. The prairie land sold for, and the woodlands across the state sold for 25 cents an acre.
Wow.
I mean, think about it, $160, you could buy a whole section.
Right.
Even at that time, you know, I mean, that is still very, very little money. Acreage in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, farmland in the 1880s was $200 to $300 an acre.
Wow.
And so people from, you know, the north came and took advantage. Of course, they were running the state at the time, so they set up the rules, and the big land holdings were put together, including a lot of Vermilion Parish. You know, the state reserve, the Audubon Reserve, state reserves 18,000 acres, Audubon's 28,000. The Exxon land's 169,000 acres of Vermilion Parish.
Wow.
It's a lot of acres that was bought at 12.5 cents an acre.
Yeah.
The original Exxon purchase was made by duck hunters from Minnesota and Michigan. And wealthy duck hunters loved duck hunting, and this was a paradise of ducks, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
phenomenal duck hunting, you know, which has changed a lot, you know.
Well, just the fauna, the wildlife of Vermilion Parish is fascinating. We have an interesting area which it's in my family's properties, is a place called Turkey Island.
Oh, yeah.
Turkey Island is right a couple of miles off of the Vermilion River, not far from Banca, south of Abbeville. And of course, it's not an island. We just,
No,
you know,
right,
it's
yeah.
it's a ridge, a rise,
Yeah.
and that's where the first settlement of George Grigg was, on the highest part of it.
Yeah.
And it was also right at the Vermilion
That's
River
on
there.
the east side of the river,
Yes,
yeah.
and that's where one of the largest Takapaw reservations was. There's thousands of artifacts have been discovered right in that area. And
If they could find a high ground too,
sure,
yeah.
and I'm sure that's why George Grigg settled right by where the Native Americans were there. But what's fascinating about that place, it is a hard bottom swamp of trees. It's an endemic spot for the Abbeville red iris. It's the only
Oh,
place.
I'm real familiar with
You
that.
heard about
Yes,
that?
yes,
That's
yes.
where it comes from originally. Now, people have taken them, we've given them away, we've donated thousands of plants
I
over
got
the
some of
years.
them. In
You
my
have
yard,
some?
yeah.
Well, but if anybody is into irises, it's really something to see the Abbeville red iris. It's the only one that's red, and it's
Yeah.
very rare.
Yeah.
Now, you can
And
see them at
there's that
Palmetto
orange.
Island.
There's some orange ones, but that's not the
No,
red.
no. And because they're in a forest with a little sunlight, they grow like almost 6 feet tall. That's what's so majestic to see
Beautiful,
them.
yeah, yeah.
Now, if there's a lot of sun, they won't grow that tall. I have some in my backyard. But if the public would like to see it, we donated thousands of plants, and they're at the Palmetto Island State Park. So
Okay.
there's a garden there that
With-
we helped to create.
That's right across the bayou where they originally were. Yeah,
That's correct.
yeah. Wow. And you know, in that history, there's places like Chinieratigue, which has become a ghost town, but Chinieratigue had a school, had a couple of churches. In fact, the church at Esther was moved from Chinieratigue to,
It had a hotel.
it had
That's
a
where
hotel,
people would-
yeah, where the
would
bishop
vacation.
went. It was had a big Coast Guard station there during World War II, it had a big tower.
To give you an idea of the population along the Vermilion River, about in the 19th century, they had a mailboat that would run the river and go from Abbeville down the Vermilion River every day.
See, the mailboat would go to Pecan Island, and it would go to Chinieratigue.
Yeah.
Ivy Richard ran the mailboat for a couple of years,
I'm-
and he shared with me a couple of years before he passed away that there was a lady at Pecan Island, this was before World War II, had learned the native Takapaw language.
Wow.
And she was the go-between. She would sell their furs, and then she would buy them traps and shotgun shells and whatever. And of course, it all come by the mailboat, you know. And Ivy said he'd get a list from the lady. He'd go to town and buy all the stuff, put it on the mailboat, and bring it back. And he said that the Takapaw would come with the geese and they'd leave. They only spent the winter here. And they were trapped, and then this old lady would, you know, they had the school canal, that's where the boat landed for the island, and she lived right near the school canal, right where the school is now,
Wow.
which is no longer a part of rich Vermilion Parish history.
Well, my parents were born about 1938. They were both from that same area. Both of my great-grandparents lived 1 mile apart. So my family's of Broussards and Perrins and right close. And they were so fortunate to be able to go trapping because every woman in the world wanted a fur coat
Sure.
in the 30s, and their furs were in Vermilion Parish. Now, the trick was to get permission to go to those lands, like Marshall Island was owned by the state. So you had to be in the right political party.
Yeah.
That's where you either long or anti-long. We were longs. So my mom and dad spent their first 2 years of their wedding life On Marsh Island with 2 other couples in one camp. 3 couples sharing one-room camps.
Chester Smith was born on Marsh Island.
I know Chester.
Yeah. Big alligator.
Well,
He became a multimillionaire.
Well, my brother wasn't born there, but the story is he was conceived there.
Yeah.
So
Well, Chester was born there.
what they would do, 2 couples would go fishing to leave some privacy for one couple, and they would take turns going fishing and staying alone.
Wow, wow.
And one time, a mother, she was going to surprise my daddy for his birthday in the marsh. She baked him a cake, and they were going to bring a supply boat was bringing them some supplies, but she hid in the boat, and she got underneath a tarpaulin. And when she got to the camp, she jumped up with her cake, and my daddy almost fell in the water. He was so excited.
Wow. But trapping was a big part of Bahian history, and kids were taken out of school 2 or 3 months at a time.
How about Trapper's Holiday?
Yeah.
Because they were all in the marsh for Christmas, so they would wait until after the trapping
Season is
season.
over, which is
to
beginning
celebrate
of March.
Christmas.
Yeah. Wow. Now all the trapping is gone. The muskrat are gone too. And it's amazing how that marshland has changed. But Bahian Parish was doing well until about 20 years ago, and then I think Hurricane Rita really whacked the dickens out of it.
And Ike too, those
Ike
both,
too,
they
both
came
of
back,
them.
back to back. My mom's,
05 and 08, yeah.
my
yeah.
mom's and dad's house, dad was dead, but mom was still living in the family home there in Henry, and she got wiped out twice. She finally moved away, and that's when we had to raise the house. So now we use it as a family camp,
Mhm.
and we have a
Yeah,
garden
I've
there. We
been
still have the
there.
barns.
Yeah,
So it's nice to keep that so our grandkids and great-grandkids can see the way it
Sure.
used to be.
sure, yeah.
And we still have crawfish and rice.
Yeah, you see those oak trees right near Banker, they have palmettos growing in them, in the forks of the trees. And you wonder how they got there. Well, after Hurricane Rita, you can figure out how they got there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. For Hurricane Audrey, 57, I was 10 years old. And I can remember like it was yesterday because it was one of the most frightening things I've ever experienced. When we knew there was a storm, but we had no communication, any idea it had already hit
Yeah,
in Cameron. And we had a family from the low-lying areas come stay with us. And about 9:30 in the morning, we noticed the water rising in the ditches. And all of a sudden, we see wolves, foxes,
Deer.
cantaloupe, deer, and the cattle panicking, rushing towards us. And then we see a wall of water about 2.5 feet just rolling in. All we had time to do was jump in the car and leave.
and you got out ahead of it.
Yes, we had enough time to get out.
Yeah, the Hurricane Audrey, the water stopped pretty much at Esther.
Yeah.
And then Hurricane Rita stopped at Abbeville.
Yeah. Well, they estimate as many as 750 people could have drowned. They're never sure because there were so many
Yeah.
transients and tourists that would go stay there for the summer. But it was a bad one for sure.
Well, Pecan Island sure got whacked. And of course, Cameron got hit so hard. And, you know, this Hurricane Laura knocked the dickens out of Cameron, you know. I mean, there's a friend of mine that has a camp on the Mermentau, and he still doesn't have electricity. Well, and that's 2 years ago.
Yeah.
You can't get gasoline anywhere on Grand Chenier. You gotta go to Pecan Island or all the way to Cameron. There's none of the stores left, there's none of the bars left. I was there a couple of days ago doing a little shrimping on one of the dock nets, they call it paupière, you know.
Our museum has a very extensive exhibit on the cattle industry. We have, in fact, I know you know the famous cattleman, Mr. Alfred Broussard.
Real well, I sold them cars.
From Cow Island.
Yeah.
Cow Island, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, well, Forked Island.
Forked Island, there's a big
Forked
debate,
Island,
Cow
yeah,
Island
yeah.
and Forked Island, one of the islands.
Yeah.
And I have his saddle, and I have
Wow.
a beautiful picture. Alan Broussard, his grandson, restored it, and what's beauty of it, we have a picture of him in the saddle, in the
Wow.
marsh, with an ox cart, and he's with his
He
wife,
would drive his cattle to
Oh, yeah,
to
he'd do the same.
Chinnerity
Yeah.
and to Mulberry Ridge.
Mulberry Ridge.
Yeah, Mulberry mostly, yeah.
And his wife, Edith Cade, is in the ox cart, so she was right there with them. The women were right there too.
Wow.
And it's a beautiful, we also have a fabulous picture of, if anybody would understand how important it was for the veterinary science to help these farmers with the diseases could destroy a herd
Sure.
so quickly. And so we had, fortunately, Dr. Leon Packer, who was a flying vet.
See, he was from Germany. My dad was from Germany.
Right. So
And they were best of friends.
I figured that.
And Dr. Leon Packer saved my uncle's life. My uncle lived about a block from us, and he was over, and he had a bandage on his hand. He said, "What happened to your hand?" That doggone, one of the pups bit me, and so I shot him and threw him. First thing Dad thought, wow, that pup might have had rabies. When did that happen? Oh, over a week ago.
Hmm.
Why'd you throw that pup? Let's go get it. So they went. My dad called Dr. Leon Packer, told him the story. He says, "Paul, get the head, bring it to me right away. I'm going to fly it to New Orleans." That's a 10-day window. And this is day 9, almost day 10, since he was bit.
Oof.
So Dr. Leon Packer flew the head to New Orleans. They were waiting for it. They tested it and let him know before he flew back that it was positive. So Uncle was actually 10 days before he got the first shots, but he survived.
Wow.
13 shots in the stomach. That's what they did for rabies. So Dr. Leon Packer, and he would fly to Pecan Island, he'd fly to Chinnerity, he'd fly to Marsh Island.
He'd land on the beach.
On the beach, vaccinate those cattle.
And he had a black Ford, and he had painted on the top in white a square, so he could spot his own car from the air, and he would land in the pastures. Even the farmers knew to have like a landing strip. I mean, as kids, we were just blown away by Dr. Leon Packer.
What a character he was. Yeah, he and my dad were big friends, and he would fly over the basin, and he'd take pictures from the air, and he'd take pictures of these real pretty lakes, and then Dad would figure out how to get to them, and they'd go fill the boat with fish. So Leon Packer, my dad didn't like to fly, but he sure liked to get the pictures of where these beautiful lakes were to go fishing.
But that got him in trouble with the U.S. government in World War II. They made him go to New Orleans and tried to accuse him of taking pictures.
My dad was the only witness in his behalf.
And they threw it out.
They threw it when my dad told him what he did for the cattle and all the different public things he did, you know. And a lot of things he did were all pro bono. He was somebody who really cared for this area and cared for the people here. And so based on Dad's testimony, it was all thrown out.
That's great.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
Well, now, we had another famous vet from Vermilion Parish, from Ukraine, Alexander Sosjawoski.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Another foreigner.
Yeah. Yes.
And quite a character. And I was about 8 years old, and he comes vaccinate some cattle. He said, "Who was the 7th president of the United States?" I said, "I don't know." He says, "That was Andrew Jackson. And next time I ask you, you better know it. I'll give you $1. I never forgot that. And he won the $64,000 question on the history, because he studied history to take his citizenship
I remember
test.
when he was on that program.
And he didn't cheat. He really won it.
Yeah.
And then he built a pool, which was very unusual to have a big private pool. He would let all the students go swimming. As long as you called, made an appointment, we'd have our class picnics there. And he was such a kind man.
And you have another famous person that was in Abbeville. He's being put up for sainthood. He was a priest, and then he served in World War II. And
LaFleur.
Father LaFleur.
Correct. He started the Boy Scout chapter.
He started Boy Scouts, and
we have a
I
canoe.
heard he to get a baseball team going to get balls and bats, he sold his watch to be able to do that.
Wow. I don't want to get off on
Yeah.
Vermilion Parish, but I'm have the honor of serving on the Historical Commission for the Vatican for the proposed sainthood of the little Cajun saint Charlene Richard.
Oh, I've heard about it.
She
Wow.
was from Richard in
Yeah.
Acadia Parish,
Acadia
but she
Parish.
died here in
By
Lafayette
units.
with leukemia. And,
Wow.
she has been unanimously voted by the U.S. bishops, and it looks like it's going to happen at some point.
Share with us your, when, I guess the president offered an apology for interring the Japanese during World War II. You were
Yes.
also, that led you to ask the Queen of England to apologize for kicking the Cajuns out of Nova Scotia.
You know, history, as we know, is written by the victors, and so it's never a
For
bad
sure.
thing to re-examine
Yeah,
history.
right, yeah.
And that's what gave me the idea. America was big enough to acknowledge a wrong. Probably the greatest wrong America ever did was the Trail of Tears,
Yes.
moving the Native Americans.
Under Andrew
That
Jackson.
was bad.
That was
Hard
horrible.
to top that. But the Acadian deportation, a third of the Acadians perished. 4 ships went down, 800 people drowned, and 80% of them were children because the families were large.
Yeah.
So, the average 12 kids per family. And so it just said to me, look, if America can do it, I'm going to have the crown in England. And when I started it, they had never apologized in their 1,000-year history. But
Yeah.
the Queen went apologized in New Zealand in 95 to the Maori people for stealing that island from them. So I knew I had a chance. And timing was wonderful. I luckily started it in 90. The Berlin Wall fell in 89. Soviet Union crumbled in 93. So the 90s was a good period of introspective looking at histories.
Yeah.
There was no major conflict in the world during the 90s. And so ultimately the Queen, with the help of many, many people, lobbying her, and especially Prime Minister Jean Chrétien of Canada, got involved.
How
It had to
wonderful.
come from the Canadian government
Sure.
because it took place in
Yeah,
Canadian lands.
Yeah.
And he,
right.
he got behind it, and it was the last official act before he left office, December 9th, 2003, which we're celebrating the 20th anniversary this year.
Wow. Yeah, that was great. That,
It's remarkable that it has legs. How it's used in French immersion schools because it's a bilingual document. It's very
Yes.
simple, it's simplistic, but it's the first time England acknowledged that they deported the Acadians. And they acknowledged the deaths and suffering, and they acknowledged,
ethnic cleansing, huh?
that's correct,
Right.
exactly. And we established a day of remembrance. It's July 28th. Every July 28th, we meet in St. Martinville with the French Mass, and we have a ceremony. It's
Oh.
not a celebration, it's a memorial to the ancestors
Wow.
who suffered
Great.
so much to
And
transplant
that's
their
the old
culture.
church in
Yes,
St. Martin?
they call it the Church of the Acadians.
Yeah, built in what, 18?
And we used that day of July 28th because it was on that day in 1755 that the British government signed the order of deportation.
When the Union occupied this area, they burned nearly every town. They burned Lafayette twice. They didn't burn St. Martinsville. That somehow the young ladies of St. Martinsville got to the Union officers with pies and smiles and convinced them they shouldn't burn the town. And their main mission was to save the church.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I didn't know that
part
story.
of the Cajun history. But Vermilion Parish has, wow, what an amazing history. We were talking about the rum running of Vermilion Parish with the vessel I'm Alone. And Warren is familiar with some of the people who were involved. The Mosses were running the boats and hauling the liquor out. Lennox Moss, who was the farmer on the McGee farm right next to your property, and in the 1929, he claims that he took some of the last case of whiskey off of the I'm Alone, which was sunk by the Coast Guard. I think it was March something in 1929. And he had 2 bottles that he kept. And at the anniversary of the sinking of the I'm Alone, they'd have a little gathering and celebration, remembering the I'm alone and all the money they made on it because they ran this boat. They made a trip about every 2 weeks, and they had this is about 100-foot vessel that was loaded with whiskey, and be 20 or 30 boats from
Wow.
Abbeville, from New Iberia, from Lafayette, you name it, Franklin, would all come to Southwest Pass and haul that whiskey back up. And so at the anniversary, whoever was there for the gathering, they'd draw straws. And the shortest straw would get to take one jigger from one of the bottles.
Well, listen, that's a good segue into probably the most famous native son of Vermilion Parish, I would argue, was Dudley J. Cousin de Leblanc. Mesdames et messieurs et mes chers amis. He would open his radio show. Every Sunday.
Yeah, every Sunday afternoon.
He reached about 40,000 people, and most of them voted for the candidate that he asked them to vote for. So he was a powerful man, and was born north of Erath, but near Youngsville, but then his daddy was a blacksmith and moved to Erath. So we have the largest collection of his memorabilia. It's phenomenal. It could be a museum just to him. And he, of course, he started a funeral burial policy, Thibodeau Benevolent.
Yes.
And he became a salesman with Huey Long. They started together as drummers and walking salesmen. But then they fell out in politics. And Huey knew there was a lot of, he knew where the bones, the skeletons were buried. And as soon as Huey was elected governor, he told Huey, leave the state or I'm going to indict you. And Dudley moved to Port Arthur and Beaumont, and until 34, when Long was assassinated, Dudley came back and started Hadacol.
Wow.
And that became the largest employer in Lafayette Parish for about a decade.
That's just amazing. And all the jokes about Hadacol.
Yeah. Somebody said, why did you call it Hadacol? He said, I had to call it something.
My daughter has one of the jokes on her refrigerator, and it says, I couldn't read and write, and I took 2 bottles of Hadacol, now I'm teaching school.
Well, it was 14% alcohol and some vitamins in there. So it didn't hurt you, and you could, when you couldn't buy booze on Sundays or in dry parishes, you could buy Hadacol. There was no FDA. There was no federal regulation at that time when he started
It
it.
was kind of harmless, and yeah.
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 But he went on You Bet Your Life, Groucho Marx show. You can see it on YouTube. And Groucho said, well, Senator LeBlanc, what would Hadacol do for me? He said, I don't know what it'll do for you, Groucho, but for me it did $5 million last year. He had a farm where he invented it on Lake Penure, which is on the border between Iberia and Vermilion. The lake is in Iberia, but the boundary is the west portion of the lake is the parish. Just north of Delcombe, where you had that terrible mine disaster in 1981, where Texaco accidentally punctured the salt mine, Crystal.
Yeah, there's quite a story behind that.
That could be a whole show on that.
Oh, yeah, right.
But that's where he had a farm on the lake, and he invented Hadacol. You can still see at low tide bottles that were thrown away there on the edge. And when he got wealthy, he started raising these little Shetland ponies. And of course, he made a lot of people's careers, namely Hank Williams, Sr., became famous on these cavalcades. They travel all over the South. And while they're in a big tour in Texas, Hank's wife goes into labor, and Hank wanted to go with him. And Dudley said, you can't go. I need you for this show. You're the big hit.
Yeah.
So to entice him, he said, I'm going to give your baby boy a Shetland pony. And he did. And Hank Williams Jr. had a Shetland pony donated by Dudley LeBlanc.
Wow. Wow.
And there's a picture of him riding the horse.
Wow. And they had about a 60-foot Chris Craft, beautiful varnish boat. It was called the Hadacol Mist. And I often wonder when they sold Hadacol, they did sell it, I think, for $2 million.
Yeah, they sold it from a group of businessmen from New York.
New York, right, yeah.
And it went bankrupt shortly thereafter. it didn't survive. But Dudley didn't miss a beat. He just started other products. He did Carry On.
Carry On, right.
He had ant poison. He had CP37. He had oils.
And he was in the Senate forever.
Yeah, he was a very powerful state senator, and it's been told to me that he
Wasn't
helped.
his brother the sergeant at arms?
Yes,
So-
Sassoon, I think.
So
Was,
LeBlanc.
yeah, so.
And then his aide, when So passed away, his aide became the sergeant of arms.
Baudouin,
Baudouin.
Charlie Baudouin,
Charlie Baudouin, and he was from Erath also.
Delcom,
Delcom, okay.
close by.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But the radio show, nobody could pronounce John McKithen's name. Couldn't say, so that's when John McKithen went to Dudley LeBlanc. They brokered a deal. They gave a big barbecue in Vermilion Parish. I have the posters. All the men, Alfred Broussard and them killed calves, major barbecue, and they got Vermilion Parish, Iberia to go with McKithen and turn the
Got him
tide.
elected.
And so he tried to get Dudley named president of the Senate, and they brokered a deal along with Jimmy DiMaggio. They formed Codeville as a result of that. See, this was '68.
Yeah, yeah.
So Jimmy and Dudley were political enemies, but they were both fighting to save the French language
Yeah,
in different ways.
yeah, for sure. The rich history of Vermilion Parish. And share with us the UL, one of the first Japanese graduates of UL was a weightlifter also.
It was the
Kind of
weightlifter.
Share
that-
with us.
Yeah, at 4 years old, his family, they lost their large farm in California. They were put in concentration camp for 4 years in swamps of Arkansas.
They lost all their homes.
Lost
and all.
everything.
Yeah,
And at the end of the war, in fact, there were 8 kids, and one was born in the camp. And they were told that the guards were there to protect them. And their daddy said, they're not protecting us because the guards point their rifles towards us. So,
yeah.
but to show the patriotism, they had 4 boys, and they all joined the American military after the war. Walter joined the U.S. Army, but he joined after he graduated from SLI.
Wow.
He went to Baton Rouge, and his daddy went from being a successful farmer in California to pulling weeds. The only people that would hire him were the Jewish families of Baton Rouge. Walter tells that story, and he breaks down crying.
Wow.
And his daddy ultimately opened Amahara's nursery, and Walter took it over because he graduated in horticulture. Some of his closest friends were Lafayette people, like Kent Longlanet, Kent's nursery,
Yes.
gave him a job. Red Laurel came down to work at Mike's gym. Mike Stansberry had a gym on Jefferson.
Yes.
He let Walter live because he had no money. He lived upstairs in the gym, and he would sweep the gym at night to compensate Mike. And Mike's gym became Red's gym. But Walter became the first national collegiate champion of any sport at the university here in Lafayette. He won 3 national championships.
This is
in the 50s.
weightlifting.
Olympic weightlifting. We had 8 national collegiate champions in 13 years, from 75 to 57 till 71. I was on 3 of the teams. That's why I wrote this latest book, The Power of an Apology, The Weight of History, because all of this influenced me to try to redeem the good name of the Acadians.
One of the persons was of the Jewish faith, and he was killed in Munich.
That's correct. And he couldn't make the U.S. team. His name was David Berger. He was a Jew who attended Tulane. Tulane's about 60% Jewish students.
Yeah.
And he emigrated to Israel, and although he was a pacifist, he had to join the Israeli army to be able to compete on the Olympic team, which he did.
Wow.
And he lifted on September 5th, 1972. And Walter Amahara and his wife went to watch him lift in Munich. That's how close we were.
Yeah.
I couldn't go. I was working for a judge at the Court of Appeal. I'd just become a lawyer. And he successfully
Judge Frugier?
Judge Cleveland Frugier was my
Yeah.
boss. And 72 hours after he fulfilled his dream of 28 years, he was 28 years, he had 3 degrees from Tulane psychology, he had a law degree from Columbia, and an MBA from Columbia. He sacrificed it all. He left his wife in New York because she wouldn't go with him. They had an amicable divorce. Now that's sacrificing everything for a goal. And he thought the way to world peace was through the Olympic mission of unifying
Yes.
people. And then Black September broke into their dormitory, captured 11 Israeli athletes, including David. They were held hostage for 22 hours, and ultimately the municipal police of Germany attempted to rescue them in it was a failed attempt, and all of them were killed, including
Wow.
David.
30 seconds.
Hey, we've got to end the program. Thank you, Warren, for sharing all the history of the Million Parish, the Cajun history,
20 seconds.
Guzan Dud, and so forth. So, really honored to have you here and share that rich history of our area.
10 seconds.
So, thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Yes,
Howard.
sir.
5 seconds. Good show.
Merci beaucoup, mon ami.
Yes.